Good. Okay, welcome everyone. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker today, our own Dr. Nathan Benz. So Nathan got his bachelor degree from Williams College and a PhD in marine geophysics from Columbia University. And he then came to Austin in 1991 and has been working in the institute since then. So Nathan's research focuses on using seismic imaging techniques to study subduction zones. And he is especially well known for his 3D seismic imaging work. Over the years, he has worked on many subduction zones around the globe, including Barbados, Nankai, Chile, Costa Rica, Cascadia, and Hikurangi. And his work has greatly improved our understanding of the structure and tectonics of subduction zones. So Nathan, together with other scientists here, really make the UTIG well known for active source seismic imaging and subduction zone research. And that is how I was attracted to work in this place. So more recently, Nathan has led an international collaborative project, the NZ3D experiment, to image the Northern Hikurangi margin offshore New Zealand in 3 dimensions and to understand the mechanisms for slow slip events. So that is what we will hear today. And so without further ado, take it away, Nathan.
All right. Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Shuoshuo. I appreciate the introduction. And I also appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about an exciting project that we have done. And we had a lot of things come together, a lot of good things come together that made a tremendous difference. And I think we have some of the best images and best look at subduction zone structures in the really complex setting that these are. And hopefully this will inspire some of the younger generation to look at other subduction zones in a similar way. So what I'm going to talk about today is as Shuoshuo mentioned, the Hikarangi margin up here on the North Island of New Zealand, in the northern part of the North Island. And it's a setting where the Pacific plate is slipping beneath the Australian plate, about 5 centimeters per year relative convergence, and produces this subduction zone all along here. The Pacific plate in this area is made up of the Hikarangi Plateau, which is part of a large igneous province, and it has a lot of volcanic constructions. So there's one shown right here, the Tranganui Knoll, which sticks up above the local sediment cover. And this is one that will eventually impact the margin, but others have impacted over the years too. And so one of our goals was to try to understand what these seamounts do and how they may be impacting some of the slip processes that occur along these margins. So this is work that has a lot of people engaged and working to produce some results from this data set, and it includes a lot of people that I'm very grateful for their efforts, financial contributions, especially from New Zealand, and data contributions from Japan, and so it includes a large number of institutions from the US, from New Zealand, UK, and also Japan. So let me jump into which of these buttons will work. There we go. So let me just jump into quickly why we care about what seamounts do when they collide at subduction zones. Seamounts can be these very large volcanic constructions that produce relief on ocean crust. And when they collide with subduction zones, they cause lots of damage and potentially can produce these asperities, places where the seamount doesn't want to go down and gets locked up and causes high stresses that can build up to the levels that can rupture in a large earthquake. At least that's one of the possibilities that's believed to occur. And we know that subduction zones produce some of the world's largest earthquakes, and seamounts may potentially be involved. In a kind of a contradictory way, seamounts may be doing something quite different, and that is they may be actually focusing a lot of the stress in the subduction zone and creating a lot of the damage shown here by these models of structure, a lot of models of faults here in map view and then here in cross section. And the idea is that if it's really focusing stress and making it high locally, that it may slip in fairly small earthquakes and fairly frequently rather than allowing a very large earthquake. So we really need to know more about what seamounts are doing in subduction zones. In the case of New Zealand, it's a little bit different and not so much about great earthquakes as more about slip processes along the plate interface. And there's an interesting situation here that's been well documented, and it shows there's a lock zone in the south that's pretty broad, and then down dip from that, shown in these blue contours, is what's known as slow slip. It's slip that occurs instead of over seconds like a regular earthquake, it occurs over several weeks and allows the plate to move without producing seismic energy. And so what happens as you go to the north, that lock zone gets very narrow and the slow slipping extends out into the across the shelf and slope and very close to the trench. And one of the reasons why this may be occurring has been hypothesized the presence of seamounts here in the north that may be somewhat larger, at least in proportion to the geometry of the margin here. And there may be more of them that are impacting this slip behavior. So what we would like to do is understand this a little bit more by doing our seismic survey. And just to point out that this is a particularly key setting to look at this. This sort of shown here in this red dashed line is a hypothesized seamount that has been interpreted from some magnetic data and also from a seismic profile. This is a seismic profile shown down here. It runs along this line right through here. And it shows, the upper plate quite nicely. It shows the plate boundary, and then beneath the plate boundary is this bump here, which is inferred to be the seamount. And that seamount is in proximity to both a lot of microseismicity that's been recorded, as well as some slow slip that was recorded back in 2014, a fairly large event. So there's some coincident relationship between these, and investigating that in more detail is one of our goals. And so we aim to try to image this structure quite a bit more detail. And that's where we use this 3D technique. The 3D technique, we involve the Marcus Langseth, shown here in this little cartoon, and 4 6-kilometer long streamers that we towed behind it. And we made 62 passes through this box and covered an area that's about 15 kilometers wide and 60 kilometers long, extending from the trench across the lower slope, mid slope, and up onto the shelf. At the same time, we also had deployed 97 OBSs, here showing these little dots, about 2 kilometers nominal spacing, and recorded all the shots for the 34 days that we were out there surveying. So what I want to do in this talk is tell you just a little bit about why what we did made a difference in the imaging. And there's a lot that I could say, and I just don't have time. There's been a lot of documentation about what we did, and it's available online. I'm happy to help anybody who wants to get into that. So I'll show you a little bit about what we did to make you appreciate what we've got here now, and then get into the results. And I'm going to show the data interactively. It's a little bit of rubbing my belly and patting my head, so be patient. But I think it's a really good way to look at the data. And I'm sure you'll see interesting things and maybe some questions come up, and I'm happy to do that. But some of this plan may go awry pretty quickly, and we'll see how it goes. But that's okay. But what I'm hoping to do is give you a little overview of the margin structure in our 3D volume, show you some of the volcanic constructions on the Hikarangi Plateau, look at some of the smaller seamounts, what they're doing, look at some of the larger seamounts that we think we can see now, and then maybe at the end, some implications for slow slip. So we're very fortunate to have the CGG, geophysical company that does seismic data processing, probably one of the best in the world, that's has a lot of capabilities and was very anxious to apply them to our data set. And they did basically two things. One was a lot of signal processing to clean up the data and remove noise. And the other is in this column, the seismic imaging part of it, which is pre-stacked depth migration in 3 dimensions. And in the input to that, one of the key things, and one of the things that made a huge difference in this data set was the velocity model that went into it. The velocities control how the rays propagate in the subsurface. And so the imaging process that seeks to take that energy and put it back in the proper position and depth to create the image is guided by that velocity model. And so we needed to build a velocity model in 3D that could do a proper migration of the data. So I'm going to show just a little bit of that to give you some appreciation. So the way we did it was sort of in 2 steps. The first was looking at streamer data. So we can see our little map down here. The Langseth fired shots, and we recorded them on the 6-kilometer streamer. And so we did a full waveform inversion of the streamer data first. And that involved, the full waveform inversion process involves taking the records that we recorded from near offsets out to 6 kilometers, and then trying to create a synthetic signal that we could compare to the real data. And the synthetic is dependent on the velocity model. And then we varied the velocity model to minimize the differences between the two. And in the case of the streamer data, we had over 500,000 records that went into the inversion. And so there's just a tremendous amount from the streamer data itself. The streamers were 6 kilometers long and not sufficient to get to the deeper parts of the model. And so, so they were pretty good for the first couple of kilometers, but we really needed to get down deeper. And that's where the OBSs played a big role. And what we did with the OBSs was to use a similar full waveform inversion technique, but extending to farther offsets, including a lot of the refracted arrivals that we see in the farther offsets, and be able to add additional constraints. But one of the advantages with the OBSs is that as we're driving around here for the 34 days, not only do we have some longer offsets that we can use, but we also had a large range of azimuths. So we had rays that were traveling across and not just along the direction that we were driving the boat. So we had a lot of rays that passed on the other azimuths, and that filled in a lot more of the 3D characteristics of the velocity model. And just to give you an idea of what the ray coverage we had was, or I should mention that we did have about 6,000 records that we could use for the inversion from the OBS data as well. And just to give you an idea of what ray paths are doing, this is just one line through the data volume. I'm showing the ray paths for the red instruments. So these ray paths extend down from the sea surface down into the earth and recorded on the sea floor at this site. And then I'm showing all the red ones. These are for offsets up to 23 kilometers. And then keep in mind that we had these blue stations here, 3 in between each of the red ones. So there was very dense coverage that's not shown here. And the other thing to keep in mind is that this is one line. There are 400 lines to the north and 400 lines to the south. So there are just a tremendous amount of ray coverage that we can use for the inversion. So what we ended up with was, from our starting model here, which is a pretty featureless model, we eventually came to one that has a lot more detail in it. And you can see there's some good correlations between some of these velocity details. The purple colors here are very low velocities near the seafloor, and then the higher velocities close to 5 kilometers per second down here. And what we see is some thrusts through here with high velocities in the hanging wall and low velocities in the footwall. We could even see in places, for those of you who study hydrates, we can even see places here with some high velocities indicating high hydrate concentrations, and then free gas beneath the BSR. So there's a lot of rich detail about a number of things that we could investigate just from the velocities alone, because they tell us a lot about the material properties within this, and not just structure. So I want to point out also that this is a three-dimensional model, and this little dashed line right here is a horizontal slice through the volume, and that's shown in here. We can see just quite a bit of complexity in 3D in this velocity model. So is all this effort making a difference? And I'm hoping I can convince you that it does. This is the 2D line that we had, that was collected by GNS in New Zealand back in 2005, using a 12-kilometer long streamer. And Dan Barker put a lot of work into doing this imaging, and I think he got about as much as you can get out of a 2D line here, and was able to see quite a bit of structure in here. And it was used for doing the siting for the IUDP drilling that occurred here fairly recently. The structure here is the upper plate here. We can see this seamount through here, and then see this highly reflective zone. I should mention this highly reflective zone is thought to be one of the reasons why slow slip may be occurring here. The idea is that the seamount, as it subducts, is pushing down sediments that have lots of water in them, maybe building up high pressures and propagating up into the plate interface and controlling some of the slip characteristics along this boundary. And so this imaging was pretty important to be able to see those details. And I think the 2D line is somewhat more challenging to interpret, particularly back in these areas. So what I want to show you is that this does make some difference when we can do it in 3D data, and when we can put in the efforts to see to make the good velocity models and see these structures. So what we're seeing now, as opposed to in the 2D line, we're seeing quite nicely this long, highly reflective fault cutting down through here. We're seeing some really tight folds right in here of some of the sequences that didn't show up at all before. And we're seeing the plate boundary very nicely right through here. And I'll show you some more of this here shortly. So I'm going to switch gears slightly and show you some of the data, if this works directly. Okay, so this is the 3D volume, and we're looking now at the reflections from the seafloor. And just to get you oriented, this is, move this back a little bit, and you can see there's a lot of features on the seafloor. Here is the trench out here. We see some nice frontal thrust ridges running through here. You can even zoom in a little bit and see there's some slumps here, and then some debris from those slumps out here. And then there's a nice big slump scar right in here. A number of other ridges pop up as well. So what we're going to be looking at is in the subsurface from the trench up towards the shelf. And if this goes right, I push this button. Okay, and so now we can see this whole volume in profile. And sort of stepping back, we're seeing a lot of detail. The plate boundary is so the top of the incoming plate is here, the sediment section here, and then the Hikarangi Plateau underneath it, and that runs roughly down like this. So this is the subducting plate, and we lose it a little bit here, and then we see it more down here. And I actually want to move this a little bit in a little bit farther, get away from the edge a little bit. I think things show up a little better. And then the seafloor here, and then above the plate boundary is all this wedge-shaped body known as the accretionary wedge. And we're seeing some nice thrusts cutting through it all the way through here and here, and some back in here. And so I also want to show you that we have this velocity model that I can superimpose on top that shows our velocities. And again, the cool colors are low values up to about 5 kilometers per second. And we can see some low velocities below these thrusts, like I pointed out a second ago. And then we're seeing some of the some high velocities in here, which I think are related to carbonates, and I'll show you in a second. But the velocity information is also very useful for interpreting as well. So what I want to do, I'll turn this off for a second, and I will move up here to the front of the whole system and look at the Hikarangi Plateau. So this is what is the characteristic of the incoming plate. And push this button right here. And okay, so we can see, we know from drilling that there's a sequence here of turbidites, so clastic sediments that are all fairly recent, maybe as old as Pliocene. Underneath that, there is a carbonate, pelagic sequence with lots of carbonates in it. And then underneath that is volcaniclastic layers that make up the top of the volcanic unit of the Hikarangi Plateau. And as you can see, these cones through here are some volcanic constructions that were probably made up of some extrusives. And there's in a lot of places you can see layering within them. They may be interbedded extrusives and other sediments that have accumulated in producing this layering. We see lots of reflectivity within the subducting Hikarangi Plateau itself, and they may also be some of this interlaying of extrusives and sediments, but there may also be some sills, and these kind of shapes here suggest that they could be intrusive sill bodies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this button right here, and I'm going to flip through each slice by slice, and I'll stop here and there to show you a couple of features. But it sort of it's like a CAT scan where we can see a lot of details in this structure. Let me go back. There was one in particular that's very photogenic in terms of its construction, and that is this one in here. You can see lots of layering and very, very clear volcanic construction. If you go a little farther along, you can see there's another one that's a very late stage volcanism. It is built up on top of the pelagic sequence right here. So it's a very late stage in the system. So there's clearly lots of volcanism that's gone on here, building these sort of small cones for quite a long period. So let me just flip through to the northern side of the profile of the volume and move up here. And we don't see quite as much in terms of those small volcanic cones. There is a ridge that's building right in here. It's just off the edge of the volume. And there is, we go to the far end and I zoom out, we can see, and I turn on this button right here. This is work that Andrew Gase has done, looking at all these volcanoes and looking at the top of this volcanic construction and mapping out these in great detail. Andrew Gase, formerly a student here and now as a postdoc working on this, and he is showing all of these volcanoes that form along this ridge. And so what seems to be happening is that there's lots of local peaks, but there's also sort of a broad construction in here too. So how we define what a seamount is really matters on what we're sort of trying to understand about what the collision process is. Is it, you know, these small ones? Is it sort of broad ridges, et cetera? Those are sort of important considerations for this. So what I want to do next is to move back here and just show you one little spot where one of these volcanoes is interacting with the frontal ridge system, and that's this one right here. Let me turn this off for a second and move back here. And so what we see is a small cone here, and we can see a thrust that forms along the leading edge of that, and it extends up through the sediment section and allows this upper portion to propagate onto the seafloor. In the behind the seamount, we see very little faulting. There's more faulting here than there is here, suggesting that this is under more stress than what's in the wake of the seamount. So that is important to keep in mind for what I'm going to show you next. And what I'll show you is moving this way. Moving this up here. And moving this way, I can show you that one of the things that happens to a lot of these cones is that they get accreted into the accretionary wedge. So we can see a good example of one right here. So the plate boundary is now down here. This is the upper plate, and this volcanic cone has been accreted into the upper plate. There may be others that are thrust up these ramps. And so they're being assimilated into the accretionary wedge. But what I wanted to show you was, if we move to the north, I want to show you this fault right here. Most of the faults that we see in the south are very typical of what we find in accretionary wedges, which is a fairly steep angle fault. Is about 30 degrees here. They may show up a little bit more to the south. So yeah, there's a regular sequence of faulting here. So these faults cut down and connect to the plate boundary fault underneath, another one here, and another one back here. And this is the accretion process, the collision process that applies stress to this whole system, is causing these thrusts to be active and thickening this whole section into the accretionary wedge. And in the southern part here, these are pretty typical of these steep thrusts. When we go to the north, though, I want you to keep an eye on this one right here. This is known as the Papaku Fault right there. It was drilled during the recent drilling expedition. And what you notice is that as you go to the north, that fault has a very low angle and gets longer and longer. And then as we get up to about here, it sort of reaches its greatest length. So right in here. And this fault is about 15 kilometers long. And then the sequence, the sediment section that's underneath it, is virtually unbroken for about 20 kilometers. So it's a very long section of sediment that doesn't seem to have had a lot of stress applied to it, because otherwise we would see a lot more faults through it. And so what it suggests is that this is has been grown in here in a very low stress setting. And the other thing to notice is this really long fault here was probably the plate boundary for an extended period of time, because the fault was very active in order to allow it to slip this long distance. And it has only recently stepped down to a lower position, where it then propagated out towards the deformation front here. And there's been a few hundred meters of slip on this fault now. And it has just recently started slipping on here, and maybe less active on this section of it here. So I think we have some idea of what the cause of this quite unusual structure is. And I want to show you what we can see a little bit further down dip. And what we're seeing is this big bump right here. And this appears to be a fairly prominent seamount. Oops, let me move that back. And as you can see, see a little more of it here. this bump sticks up about 2 kilometers or so, 1.5 to 2 kilometers, depending on how you measure it. And it is just down dip of this lens or this piece of fairly undeformed sediment. It's fairly steep on this side, and the plate boundary, I think, runs right along here. And then this fault comes right off the top of that seamount. So we've digitized this surface, and we have a good idea of what that looks like. And I want to show that now, and that would be this button. Nope, this button right here. Okay, so this is our, oops, I need to just fix something real quick. Okay. So this is our seamount. I'm not sure exactly what happened here because it seems to be, all right, seamount's in the wrong position, but I can fix that. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So it's in the right position here now. So it's so this is the whole seamount here. This is what I've called the Papaku seamount because it's connection to the Papaku Fault. These very patriotic colors are magnetic anomalies. So this red area in here is a high magnetic anomaly, which is consistent with a volcanic igneous material that may have been magnetized. And there's another surface down here, the little bump here that may actually be another seamount, and then some negative anomalies up here. So it's consistent with the magnetics reasonably well. And what I want to show you is that this piece in here, so the Papaku Fault extends like this, and the Papaku Fault has wraps around this way. And so if you look at it from this direction, you can see, and I can cut this off a little bit so you can trim it a little bit so I can see it better. And what you can see is that it's got this lateral ramp running down this way. And that lateral ramp conforms quite nicely to the geometry of the seamount here. And so to convince you that a little bit more, I can show you, turn that off, and I can move this back to this position right here. Move this up to about here. And if I hit this button, I think I will be able to, turn that off first. Okay, if I hit this button, I think I can essentially move this subducting crust up dip, essentially unsubducting the whole lower plate, and watch what happens as it gets to shallow depths here. You can see it fills in quite nicely the space between the Papaku Fault here and where the seamount is. So if it turn this off, you can see here's the Papaku Fault running right here. Here's where the plate boundary is now, but the when I unsubduct it here, it shows up fitting very nicely into that space. So there's clearly a connection between that geometry and this sort of lens of sediment that's in here and the fault, the seamount. So I can push this back, put the seamount back to its proper place, and you can sort of imagine that as this subducts, it's carrying in the wake of that seamount, sort of protected in the stress shadow of that subducting seamount. It is carrying this sediment lens that sits in there. It carries it in the wake of the seamount. So what I want to show you here, you can see quite easily these strata here are parallel to the fault and are very consistent with the seamount having the upper plate sort of ride over the top of the seamount, and then the strata underneath are very horizontal, consistent with these sediments following in the wake of the seamount, sediments that were originally on the in the trench. And so the other thing I want to point out with my velocity model. So here's the velocity model. And I can superimpose both together and show you that this area in here seems to be pretty consistently low in velocities. And I think that's because the velocities are reflecting a delay in consolidation. So these sediments have been thrust underneath fairly rapidly. They've been loaded fairly rapidly, and they have not really consolidated enough yet to achieve the higher velocities that we see at equivalent depths on either side. And so that suggests there's quite a bit of fluid that may be retained within this lens in here. And it may also be related to less stress that is accompanied with being in the wake of the seamount, and less stress to squeeze the sediments and force the water out. So this is a sort of a characteristic of this sediment lens, is this low velocity, and presumably excess or elevated fluid content. So let me just show you, turn this one off and show you that okay, so move this one back like this. Okay. So we're seeing in the wake of the seamount this lens of underconsolidated sediment. The characteristics of the seamount seem to be generating this very long, low angle thrust, the low velocities in the sediments in behind, and then that lateral ramp where it tapers off as the seamount on the flank of the seamount. And those kind of characteristics, I think, are things that we also see in other parts of this volume. And let me show you, move around this way. Okay, so let me move in this way and show you this fault here. That's, if I move away from the edge a little bit, I think you can see it quite nicely. Yeah, so here we see another very long, low angle fault that cuts through the whole accretionary wedge down to the plate boundary down here. And if I move around this way and look at from the side and show you, zoom in a little here and show you what we see on the side, there is again a nice lateral ramp that comes down this way. And so there's a very large space in here that looks very similar to the case that we've caught virtually in the act of growing. And we have another example of one that may be from an earlier seamount collision. And it has those same kind of characteristics, this very low angle and the lateral ramp. And then again, if I turn on the seismic velocities, we see here, we're seeing lots of low velocity values within it and lower than the surrounding area. So this is, again, low velocities down here. And these low velocities are very close to the plate boundary. So this, what looks like, based on what we can tell from this recent seamount subduction, this looks like a seamount that came through, maybe a much larger seamount that came through sometime in the past and left behind this same kind of lens of sediment that, excuse me, that we see that happened further up dip and more recently. And so the question is, you know, do these sort of sediment lenses have impact on the slipping processes that occur underneath them? And I just want to show you another way to look at these, which I think is pretty interesting, is to show you, if I turn this off, or actually I'll leave that on. I'll show you what we can, with the 3D data, we can look at it in lots of different, slicing it lots of different ways. And one of the ways we can look at it is by looking at horizontal slices, which are also quite revealing. So let me slide this back this way. And I'm going to start sort of near the top here and show you the horizontal slice through this. This now is the Papaku Fault right here, has a nice sharp reflection. So we're slicing through horizontally, and we see lots of details with the structure in the horizontal slices too. I don't have time to talk a lot about that, but I want to show you what happens when we move down through the section, and we can see this feature starts to take more form. There we go. And pretty soon here, I think you'll see emerging is that seamount right in here. So this is where the seamounts pass through, and has really the sediment lens that follows in behind is right back in here. So that's for the up dip one. And now let me move back this way and show you, you see something pretty similar for the down dip one. And that looks like this. So again, this fault curves around like this, presumably because as the seamount passed through, everything, the upper plate ran over the top, and in the wake back in here, all the sediment came sliding in behind it. And that left this, this pod of sediment, presumably also of low velocities. So let me stop here and okay, let me move this out of the way. One other thing that while I'm showing you here, one other thing that's really propped up that I think is worth showing is I look at the velocities and look at what happens to the velocities in down dip from the Papaku seamount. So go back to here and move this one back here. So I showed you that there are low velocities in the up dip portion, but if we move down dip from the seamount, let me just get this so you can see better. All right. So here's again the seamount here. Up dip, we saw low velocities. There are zones down dip that have very high velocities. And these are potentially areas where, you know, this is the stress shadow of the seamount. This may be areas of enhanced compression as the seamount's colliding and squeezing these rocks to either to compress them and dewater them more and increase their seismic velocities. So if I move this down a little bit further, you can see this is a pretty broad zone of low velocities, which may even show up in the horizontal slices as well. Yeah. So if you look in the horizontal slice, you can see zoom out here a little bit. You can see this pocket in here of high velocities, which is immediately down dip from this subducting seamount. Okay, so let me move this over here again, and then I can bring back this one. Okay. Oops, I need to go to here and push this to presentation. Okay. So, yeah. So I think the most prominent thing that we've seen from this, the impact of seamounts is these, the effects in the trailing or in the wake of the seamount. So these lenses of low velocities, potentially overpressured zones, are the most prominent thing that have stood out so far. And there's this Papaku one here that's just recently happened and essentially caught it in the act, but these are older ones. So this is an older one that has been passed through and left similar kind of features, low velocities, overpressured, potentially overpressured zones, and just above the plate interface. This is not to say that what happens below the plate interface is unimportant. Certainly, there's a potential for large amounts of water to go down within the subducting Hikarangi Plateau, but certainly we need to think more about what happens within the conditions in the upper plate and how that may be influencing what's happening at the plate boundary. And so I just want to show you this last slide and leave some time for questions. But this kind of gives you an idea of what we need to start thinking about more. Certainly the Papaku seamount and the lens that was left behind. So this shows here in this dashed line in green, the outline of the Papaku seamount. And then in magenta, or in the cyan color is the lens that's left behind. And we're not seeing all of it. There may be some more of it off the survey here, but it's relatively shallow, and relative to the slip contours of the 2014 slow slip event, it is relatively small and may not have much influence on the slipping process. The older one that went through, this one right here, is may have quite a bit more of it off the side of the survey. So there may be quite a bit more of it to the south, and maybe getting closer to the size, the dimensions of some of the slipping, the largest slipping in the 2014 event. But this may not be the only seamount that's passed through here either. And the effects of this one, which is now well subducted below our survey and out of the picture, has left some pretty long lingering effects in the upper plate. And some of the other ones that may have passed through in past times may have some lingering effects down here in the south as well. So collectively, the number of seamounts passing through and their sizes, some which are quite a bit larger than the ones we see here, are potentially have some impact on the slip processes here. I think I'll leave it at that, and I will be happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, some very nice stuff. So do you know of any expression of these low velocity zones and overpressure zones in the landward expression of the accretionary wedge?
Well, one of the interesting things that happens here, and let's see if I can, what should I show you here? Let me get out of that and move back here and show you one of the things that we can see in the data. So let me is, just turn this one off for a second and show you. This is, let me do this forward. Okay. Sorry, I got the wrong button. Okay, so what we can show, what I can show you is that in the more seaward portions, we saw a lot of thrust faults, so there's a lot of compression that's going on, and it's beneath those that we see a lot of the underconsolidated, presumably fluid-rich zones. And then what we see on the very landward side is these kind of features, which show up quite nicely in the horizontal slices. And so you see these lines here, and these are all normal faults. So what happens is that it transitions from being very much horizontal compression in the lower slope area and mid slope area, and as you go up dip, you get into a lot more extensional or closer to extensional. So this provides some opportunities for fluids to leak out, and there have been lots of observations, and you can see fluid seeps and things on land, and they tend to be farther landward, and that's probably because of this change in the stress field.
Thanks for the interesting talk. I have two questions. The first one is, what are the depths of those seamount? And the second one is, how do you think the seamount will influence the regional fluid flow?
I didn't catch the last one.
Last one is, how do you think the seamount will influence the fluid flow?
Okay, so you asked about the depths, and this depth down to about down to here is about 10 kilometers. So the seamount that we see in the north, this one up here, this one up here, the top of it is about 5 kilometers depth. So this is still pretty shallow. And then the one that passed through has already subducted much deeper. But in this end of the survey, we're about 10 kilometers depth. And so the question is, the second question was, how do the seamounts affect the fluid flow? And I think that's an excellent question, and we don't understand very well at all and need to investigate more. But they certainly are impacting how the fluids, so the hydrogeology here, by changing what is subducted, and changing stress levels, what is subducted, how rapidly it's subducted, and that sort of thing. But the real question is, what happens to the fluids that we see here that are in the lower plate, and how they may work their way up into connect to the plate boundary up here. So these are questions that we still need to investigate further. But it's a very complex system, and the seamounts play somewhat of a one important role, but there's a lot of other things going on as well.
Oh, there's another question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great talk. Just a quick question. So you mentioned that this seamount was first hypothesized based on magnetic anomaly. I'm just curious if there were any other observations, say geomorphology or gravity, that helped us hypothesizing this.
I don't know of gravity. I don't know if it would be sensitive enough to see that kind of a feature. but I can show you one of the clues that we have about subducting seamounts is some of what happens in the seafloor morphology. And I mentioned this escarpment right here. This escarpment is right in line with the seamount that we found. So this seamount down here is very much in line up dip with where it had passed through here and probably oversteepened the seafloor and caused this landslide to occur. So this is a pretty good clue as to the indication of seamounts passing through, and this has been seen in a lot of other margins too. So this sort of feature is very helpful. There's also a bit of a ridge right here. You can see if you look along this way, there's a little bit of a ridge right here, which may also be a bulge related to the seamount passing. So these are kind of clues that are important, but it may depend a lot on the geometry of the seamount. This one has a pretty steep leading edge here, and it's about 25 degrees here. And if it's more subtle, if it's broader, or you're in sort of the southern flank of the seamount, it may be pretty broad and not produce those same kind of features. So I think we still have a lot to learn as to what the real impacts, the full impacts are of a lot of these subducting features. Yep.
Great talk, actually. I don't know much at all about any of this, but I was questioning the IODP stuff. I know that when they drill, they are very, very specific, and there's like things that can be found explicitly at that spot. They choose it before this, and then either way, what are they looking for at that spot that you said they drilled? Where's it at in relation to like these subducting seamounts?
Okay, so let's do that. Let me just switch back here quickly, and let me show you one of these. Yeah, this one here. This shows where the drill sites were, and the drilling was fairly shallow. So it penetrated the Papaku Fault, the one that I pointed out, and they also sampled up here in the mid-slope basin, as well as the incoming plate back here and here. And they really did not drill deep enough to learn much about the seamount itself, except for drilling into this fault, which, as the new data shows, was very much a result of this subducting seamount. What they did do is they drilled into these sites, which characterize the material on the Hikarangi Plateau in much more detail, so we know ages, lithologies, et cetera, and know more about the volcanic lasting material that is in here, and that helps characterize what this is, and we can potentially project downward to characterize what seamount is. So that's some of the way that the drilling helped in terms of the seamount, and also get some idea of what the fluid content may be in some of these zones in between seamounts. So, all right.
One last question.
Yeah, thanks. So do you know why some of the seamounts got accreted, whereas others pass through? Is there like a size where it gets accreted to the upper plate, or do you just not know?
Well, I presume that some of it has to do with size, because the ones that we saw accreted to the base were all the small ones. And the one that I was describing here, the Papaku seamount, is quite large. And so I think it tends to resist that, being scraped off. Although there is one that actually is pretty large, we think is this underplated seamount as well, which is also fairly large. So, so I think size is one main things. But the other thing to remember is I showed you that in the Hikarangi Plateau, there's a lot of layering. And so as during its construction, seamount may have been built up on top of lots of material, the interlayered material of extrusives and sediments and so forth. And so there could easily be weak layers that exist underneath those seamounts. And that enables slipping or enables a fault to form underneath them and allows them to be attached to the base as they're subducted. So they may not be all that well coupled to the subducting plate because of those weak layers under them. So that may have some bearing on it as well. And the smaller ones may be more susceptible of that than the bigger ones, especially. So.
Hey, yeah, let's thank Nathan again for the great talk. So we will have lunch following the talk. So anyone like students, scientists are welcome to join the lunch and chat with Nathan more. Okay, so we will be meeting in the lobby at 11:45. So for people who are interested in joining the lunch, we can meet there. All right, great. Thank you all.